Chuck, thank you for that overly generous introduction. I shirk a little bit from the title of foremost expert on anti-Semitism, especially when I address an audience like this, an organization that has had such deep and long experience in combating anti-Semitism. What I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about what I've seen in the 6 months I've been on this job, in my travels at the State Department, and talk about what I think where we need to be concerned both as a United States government and as a Jewish community. First though, I'd really like to get a sense of who's in the room. So could you raise your hand if anybody who's here from Europe, because that's where most of my travel has been. Raise your hand, only one, two, Europe? No, only 2 Europeans, okay. How many people from Latin America are here today? Okay, well, I would hope I'd hear from both of you. I'm going to speak largely about my European experiences. I hope to get to Latin America this winter, and I would particularly like to hear from you in our question and answer period about your perceptions of anti-Semitism in Latin America, in particular your countries you're from. So, as I said, I'd like to talk about my experiences, but I think to do so, really got to talk about my kind of background, which Chuck outlined. So like many in this room, I've been involved with Jewish communal affairs for many years, and coming into this job, if you'd asked me what were the 2 largest issues facing the Jewish community today, I would say Israel and the question of assimilation, Renaissance, renewal in the United States. And of course, these issues are only tangentially connected to anti-Semitism. But I think I've had a 6-month baptism, so to speak, in this topic, and though I'm not shocked at what I found, I do think I'm a little taken aback by the extent and the levels of anti-Semitism, at least in Europe, in these 6 months. So I want to talk about what is the nature of the threat, how serious is it, and perhaps we can end with what we think maybe we can do. I think anti-Semitism, you have to start, at least I do, at looking at the demographics of this world Jewish population. As you well know, 85% of Jews in the world are from North America or Israel today. And they experience anti-Semitism in very different ways than the Jews of Europe and Latin America. In Israel, of course, though there is classical anti-Semitism, the largely anti-Semitism affects Israel as Israel is attacked, not or criticized in what we would say as unfair or stepping over the line manners. And this is in the question of double standards, defamation of Israel, delegitimization of Israel. And we'll talk a little bit about this later. In the United States, I think, having grown up in this country, I can comfortably say that for us, we have almost no conception of what anti-Semitism, or American Jews in general, have no conception of what anti-Semitism is classically. I think we have to get our perspective here in the sense that this diaspora community, though we have anti-Semitism in the United States, is really unique of any diaspora community in 2,000 years in terms of our ability to operate as first-class citizens in a society. And especially for those of my generation and younger, we have really not experienced anti-Semitism like Jews have experienced it for 2,000 years. Now, that's not the case with my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, and the difference between the United States, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the 20s and 30s are dramatic. But I do think it makes it harder for us to get our handle around what is going on around the world in terms of Jew hatred. And then we come to the 15% of the world that's not in North America or Israel. And that's what I've been concentrating on. For me, the best way to kind of say how bad are things out there is to use history as a measuring stick. And the easiest way to do that is say, is this the 1930s? Some Jewish leaders around the world have compared what's going on in the world today to the 1930s. And I think there are some interesting comparisons. There are similarities. First, we have in Europe today parliamentary parties that are openly anti-Semitic, but also have street militia. That we've not seen since the National Socialists, the 1920s and 1930s. Today we have Der Strömer type material, in some ways, because of the internet, getting much larger circulation throughout the world. Much of this material is coming out of, ironically, countries with no or few Jews in the Middle East. We have an Iranian power that is on the verge of acquisition of nuclear weapons, which openly threatens Israel's right to exist, and talks about nuclear holocaust. And we have economic bad times, a recession that's worse since the worst economic downturn since the 1930s. So there are some similarities. But frankly, there are also a lot of differences, and I think we have to be very, very realistic when I, especially for my job, going back to the Secretary of State, going back to the White House, and I think it's important to give the most realistic assessment I can. So here are the differences. Iran is not the National Socialist Germany. Iran is not the preeminent military power in the world. Iran is a threat to Israel, but it is different than Germany. Israel is also a refuge for Jews, but a refuge that also is quite capable of defending itself, unlike world Jewry in 1939. By and large, governments where Jews live are not openly anti-Semitic, as we saw often in the 1930s. Often they're not doing enough, they're not doing the right things, but they are not themselves propagating anti-Semitism, by and large, with the obvious exception of Iran. And there are other refuges, other than Israel. The United States, if you're in the EU, you can move around the EU. People are going to the UK now. So it is not like 1939 when there was no place to go. So how is the state of anti-Semitism? If it's not exactly the 1930s, and yet there are parallels to the 30s, the first thing I would say is I have not met a single person who would not tell me that it's not worse in the last 13 years since the turn of the century, dramatically worse than the 80s and 90s. I have found almost no one who has told me it's getting better. Well, a few cases in a few countries, but by and large in the last 5 years since the economic downturn, the consensus is that things are getting worse in addition. I think the situation with Israel and the double standard we see around the world, and how Israel is treated, how Israel is delegitimized, its right to exist is questioned, how it's defamed, how many times you see the comparison of Israel is doing to the Palestinians what the Nazis did to the Jews. And I think it's important for us in the United States government to say it is legitimate to criticize Israel. We think the way Israel should be treated is just like any other nation. But when this criticism stops over the line, double standards, defamation, delegitimization, that's where we draw the line. And we say this is illegitimate. If you travel in Europe, especially Western Europe, you can't help but be taken by the levels of violence. It's shocking to me, frankly, that Jews in places like France and Belgium are much more subject to violence than Jews in Eastern Europe. The violence in Toulouse last year is blood-chilling. You hear the stories of what happened in Toulouse and how this has affected the Jewish community. But of course in Eastern Europe we have the old-style right-wing xenophobia. In Western Europe we have that plus Muslim immigrant populations, themselves subject to discrimination, where real violence is taking place. And let me give you just a very direct example. About a month ago I was in Paris, and I did not go out to the suburbs where Jews are consistently attacked, where I was told that Jews who can't afford to get out of the suburbs are moving, but they're moving into particular suburbs where there are large concentrations of Jews, where they're binding together, some way that may sound good, but it also means the community is becoming much more insular and is basically being forced to separate itself from larger society. But I was in the middle of Paris in some really very nice neighborhoods, and I make a habit, if I can, to go to Shabbat services or other Hags services when I'm in Europe, give me a better sense of what not just the leaders of the community are saying. And I went to the Grand Synagogue on the Shabbat I was in Paris. And after services on Friday night, I walked with the rabbi and a few of the congregants to the rabbi's apartment in a very nice neighborhood near La Marais. This is not a neighborhood of immigrants. We went upstairs, had dinner. About 11:15, I came downstairs with the, walked with the head of the congregation. And I walk on the street, and first thing happens is the president of the congregation grabs my arm. I had to keep on. I said, take it off, it's not safe. This is the middle of Paris, in beautiful neighborhoods. Jews can't walk around with Magen Davids or kippahs at certain times of the day. The thing that finally I'll mention that has gotten me very concerned are the issues, at least in Europe, of circumcision and ritual slaughter. There has been long bans in some Scandinavian countries against ritual slaughter. There have been attempts in recent years to overturn them. They've been unsuccessful. Now we have a ban in Poland that the government is trying to overturn, but has failed at least on one occasion. I think this will continue to be a problem. Related, but I think even much more worrisome, is circumcision. And I think they're related in the sense that much of Europe has become so secular that religious freedom as a fundamental right is so downplayed that when it comes up against, say, animal rights, comes up against what people call children's rights, people say, well, there's no comparison here. We have to, it's not important, really important to consider religious freedom. Now, before I went on this trip, I was saying to people, I think we have to begin combating particularly ritual circumcision bans. Not because I think it's going to happen anytime soon. In fact, I was saying I don't think it'll happen anytime soon. But what happens in those circumstances, take a country like Hungary, where we have roughly 100,000 Jews. But there's a core of the community of 10 or 20,000. People who go to synagogue regularly, belong to organizations, etc. If you ban circumcision, it's a real problem. It's one thing to be able have to import kosher meat. But what happens when you have an 8-year-old baby, an 8-day-old baby? You're going to take him across state lines to have him circumcised? I think this is a direct threat. If you then especially hollow out that core of 10 to 20,000, they leave because of circumcision ban. I think you have a tendency for those communities to collapse. And I'm very concerned. And I'm even more concerned because I've been gone for a week in Ukraine, and while I was away, there was an announcement that the government in Norway is going to bring up regulation of circumcision. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to ban it, but I didn't expect to see this right away. I think it's now time for us as a community, and frankly as the U.S. government, to be speaking out. So I've talked about some consequences of what we're seeing. We can lose communities in Europe. And these communities, in some cases, have been around 2,200 years. The Holocaust did not just totally destroy them. They could be gone. Now, I don't want to be alarmist. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. I don't think it's going to happen to all communities. Countries in Europe are very different from what I found, and their problems are very different. But I think if trends continue, it is a real threat for certain communities. Communities, as I mentioned, are becoming insular. They're losing touch with outside society. This is, as I said, I made the example in France with the Jews in the suburbs. There will be loss of life. Anyone who saw the FRA survey, how many people have seen the FRA, Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU, put out a survey last week? Raise your hand if you saw it. Well, that's disappointing. I would ask every one of you to go on the internet or have your kids go on the internet for you, and print out the frost survey, or at least the summary. There's a lot of very shocking things there. It's a survey of 8 Jewish communities. I'm going to probably miss at least one. France, Italy, UK, Germany, Hungary, Latvia, Romania, though the sample size was too small in Romania. I'm sure I'm missing something. But sample size, it's an internet survey that was taken. The most chilling part of this is that 1/3 of Jews in Europe have thought of emigrating because of anti-Semitism. In France, in Hungary, 50%, almost 50%, I believe it's 46 and 48%. In Belgium, 40%. This goes with the people, the sentiments I heard in places like Belgium of people saying, we're telling our children at colleges and university, don't come back, there's no future here.
What's the symbols again for it?
FRA, F-R-A, Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union. It talks about fears of violence in the community. It talks about 2/3 of the community does not report hate crimes because they don't think it'll do any good. There is a lot of work to be done in Europe. And I think that if this is not an eye-opener, I don't know what is. And just this past week when the Frost survey came out, the Hungarian government, or a representative of the Hungarian government, immediately didn't focus on the problems in Hungary, but focused on the methodology. Oh, the methodology is wrong here. Good God. If the methodology is wrong by 50%, it still should be a chilling message for the government of Hungary. And I think they need to know that. So what can be done? Well, before I do that, I want to speak a little bit about Ukraine. I just came back from the Ukraine from 4 days in Ukraine. My first visit there. I was in 3 cities. 2 quotes are most memorable to me. First quote is, when you think you've understood Ukraine, you have an answer, you know you're wrong. It is an enigma. It is a very, it's a country that is in some ways very divided between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers, between East and West. It has a government that is still democratic, but some people called it thugocracy. The second quote I thought was most interesting was told to me by a rabbi near the end of the trip who said, "You've already accomplished your mission. I've been getting calls from government officials telling me to make sure I tell you that everything is good and fine and there's no anti-Semitism." Now, that actually answered some questions for me. Because on the trip, I talked to people who clearly are victims of anti-Semitism in Hungary. You can't just help but be moved by all these symbols like Babi Yar, concentration camps that are abandoned, rabbis getting beat up. And I heard that. But I also heard almost every government official but one, and he was not a member of the ruling party. Every single other one said, oh, there's no anti-Semitism in Ukraine. No anti-Semitism. Now, I knew that. If someone told me that in the United States, the U.S. government official said there's no anti-Semitism in the United States. I said, that's not correct. I know that's not right. And Ukraine, it's certainly not correct. But what was interesting to me, a number of Jewish sources also told me that there's no anti-Semitism. And then I connected the dots. Yeah, the folks who tended to be vulnerable, running small synagogues, not with any oligarchs backing them, etc. And they had to tell me, I think, that everything was fine, because if they didn't, the government would come down on them. Or they felt that the government would. They had been warned. Which again, I think if the government, I would say that if that, and I don't know this for a fact, I'm just making my guess right now. If that's the government's role, then I think they were not being very wise. It'd been much better to say to a representative of the United States government, well, we have our problems, we're working on it. When you say, no, there's no problem whatsoever, it just begs credibility. So, the most important thing I can do in the next few months, and my travel is not over, I intend to spend some time in Latin America in the coming months, go back to Europe and a couple other places. But it's really important that I convey to the people above me in the State Department, the White House, the real essence of what's going on. I think I do us a disservice if I overemphasize the level of anti-Semitism, and it's certainly a disservice if I underemphasize it. So, and that's difficult because when you're trying to describe a problem, you want to describe it in very simple terms that people can understand. And the issue is not terribly simple. The situation in France and Hungary are very bad, and yet they're very different. So what I'm struggling with is how to describe that in a compelling way. So there are other people besides myself in the U.S. government who think this is a priority. But I don't think it's just a matter of the U.S. government. It's a matter of people in this room. We have a lot of priorities. I talked about a couple at the beginning that are important. And yet, I think anti-Semitism, especially for some of these communities, they're in deep trouble. Especially for the fact that we have this kind of wellspring of hate that is being spewed out of the internet and other places, that if we don't tamp it down now, it's going to cause much greater problems in the future. Now, I'm realistic enough to know that long after I'm gone from this job, long after I'm gone from this earth, and long after my grandchildren are gone from this earth, anti-Semitism will be around. And that can be depressing sometimes. I steel myself with the idea of Rabbi Tarfon that we are not obligated to finish the task, but neither can we desist from starting it. And that's our task both in the U.S. government and us in the Jewish community. 20, 30 years ago, we literally accomplished a miracle with Soviet Jewry. Frankly, that's an easier issue to tackle. It was more easy to summarize. It had one address, the Kremlin. But I think for much of world Jewry, not least in terms of Israel as well, we're obligated to tackle this problem as a priority. Thanks so much.